Hello, I'm Brian Benfield, Deputy Chairman of the Free Market Foundation of Southern Africa. In common with the rest of our nation, our foundation is most anxious that South Africa should throw off its negative heritage, especially as far as the law is concerned. We held a conference on the 27th of July 2000 and invited some well-known legal scholars to describe the kind of justice system they believed would help to make South Africa a truly free, just and prosperous new nation. We were very fortunate to have Professor Richard Epstein from the United States as one of our speakers. He is the James Parker Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago. In introducing Professor Epstein to an eminent audience at the University of Mississippi recently, his host, Professor Michael Hofheimer, said of him, "There is no scholar in America today who is more important, more influential, more controversial, and more well-known than Professor Epstein. He is the author of many important works on legal subjects, the most famous of which is perhaps a book entitled Takings, Private Property and the Power of Eminent Domain. Also well known are his books entitled Mortal Peril, Our Inalienable Right to Healthcare, Principles for a Free Society, Reconciling Individual Liberty and the Common Good, Torts, and a book entitled Simple Rules for a Complex World." And indeed, the title of his address here is Simple Rules for a Complex World. Professor Richard Epstein.
Oh, it's a very, very great pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank you for the kind introduction. I'd like to thank Advocate Gumby for her remarks. It is really something of a great honor to be able to speak to this kind of a gathering. When I was raised in Brooklyn a long, long time ago and thought that I would go into the legal business as a law professor, I had no particular ambitions or directions, and I think for the most part, as an American lawyer, you sit in your own homeland, and there's a certain degree of powerful provincialism that takes over. We're a large country. We have 50 states. We have our own Supreme Court. We have a very complicated system. And there's a very powerful tendency when you work within your own system to think of it as the entire boundaries of the world. And one of the things that I've been most fortunate to do over the years is to have the opportunity to travel abroad and to speak and to understand that the United States is one country among many countries, and that oftentimes when we start to think about the hegemony that we assert over the world, perhaps mistakenly, often mistakenly, it's a, shall we say, a limitation on our thoughts. That is, the way in which we will become stronger at home is to learn what people have to say abroad, and the way I think that we could try to help the rest of the world is to give what we think is some views about how it is political and social institutions ought to be organized. Now, when I started to write and to think about this whole question of simple rules for a complex world, the way in which I thought about it was mainly within the framework of the Anglo-American system, with a little bit of a nod towards the Roman law system, which I had studied at Oxford when I had been an undergraduate. And the theme that seemed to me to be so important with respect to the system was as follows. Looking at the world and seeing the technical transformations that took place within society over time, what implications, if any, did that have for the nature of the legal rules that any particular society ought to adopt? And having been fortunate enough to study abroad before I lapsed back into some form of American provincialism, I had a legal education that began to some extent with Roman law rather than with common law subjects. And I was struck as I started to think about the evolution of legal systems with responses to changes in technology, as to how many of the kinds of Roman law principles that I had learned about and early medieval common law principles that I had learned about seemed to me to have, if anything, greater and more increased validity when it turned out that I was now to examine the way in which these principles applied in a modern society. So it seemed to me to be something of a paradox. That is, as you started to look over time, it's quite clear that the complexity and the nature of the interactions, the level of technical innovation would radically increase. And yet, at the same time that one saw all of these increases, I came to the odd conclusion that maybe some of the older rules for the horse and buggy age might do quite well with respect to modern civilization. And the question that one had to ask yourself is why in principle ought that to be the case? Well, I think the answer is something like this. If you're trying to figure out how lots of moving pieces fit together, there are one of two ways in which you can try to do this. One of the ways you could try to do it is to stand outside the system from on top and to figure out, as all these atoms go back and forth, what you can do as a puppeteer or as a master of marionettes to coordinate their activities. And what you discover, in effect, is that all of these individual actors are not willing to be on the end of the string, but rather have wills and desires of their own. That turning out to be the case, what happens is there is this very difficult task which becomes only more difficult as the number of people increase, as the pace of innovation increases, and as the diversity of the individuals to be regulated increases as well. The older systems, for the most part, did not start with a vision of centralized control, having one common plan for what a society, a nation, or a world should look like. Rather, in effect, it tended to stress individual autonomy and self-rule as the guiding principle, and allowed individuals to make their own arrangements one to another. And to the extent, therefore, that you have more individuals with more different beliefs of the good and so forth, the argument that one started to make is that those rules, in fact, work better as societies became more complex than they did when societies were simple. And the reason is that the level of knowledge that you could have at the center of society as to how the pieces move becomes much more diminished as the kinds of changes and the kinds of desires and the kinds of citizens subject to legal regulation increase, so that regimes of limited property rights, contractual rights, and so forth work, if anything, better in large anonymous societies than they do in smaller ones. And to the extent that one could find in the classical legal principles those sorts of elements, one had the rule that the durability of classical legal principles was very powerful, and that, of course, was one of the comments that was made in the introductory remarks. Now, as I said before, this to me was a temporal arrangement. And that when I was thinking about this particular problem, I was thinking about how it is a single legal system evolves from its simple ancestry, with simple origins, to a more complicated world. What I've discovered over the years is that the arguments here also have a geographical dimension. That is, instead of thinking about simple rules for a complex world, where the stress is on simplicity versus complexity, what one wants to do is to place due reference on the last word of this system, which is the word world. And what I've discovered over time as I've gone from place to place and have spoken and have listened to other people, is that the kinds of problems that one has have two dimensions throughout the world. One of them, there's this constant search to find some sort of general principles that we, as a matter of first principle, think should apply with respect to human interactions one to another. And then secondly, in every particular place, you have the question of how it is that you reconcile those kinds of general principles with the peculiar historical circumstances and evolution that take place in any given country. Now, on that second issue, there's an enormous degree of variation, and somebody who comes from afar must speak with enormous diffidence before he makes judgments as to the rights and wrongs of what is had in a particular culture. It's not that you don't have opinions, because believe me, I certainly do, but sometimes you don't have the knowledge to back those opinions up, and what you're prepared to believe in private ought not necessarily to be something that you'd be prepared to defend in public. We all find ourselves in those odd positions. But when it does come to the question of principle, what I have discovered is that there is this peculiar characteristic. What seems to count as a good argument in one country counts as a good argument in another. What seems to count as a relevant consideration in one country counts as a relevant consideration in another. What seems to count as a disadvantage here would count as a disadvantage there. And so when I start to think about the general questions of political philosophy and get into debates over these kinds of issues, what I discover is that it is easier for me, in some sense, to have a conversation with somebody from a radically different culture with whom I share a common set of core beliefs than it is for me to have a conversation, in many cases, from somebody who lives around the block from me who happens to start from fundamentally different political positions. In other words, what I think we can say about the power of ideas is what we can say much about general forms of intellectual property. They travel extremely well across boundary lines, and they are capable of organizing and encouraging people everywhere throughout the globe. Or they are capable, if they are bad principles, of having tremendously pernicious effects on the way in which things work throughout the globe. And so when I came here to South Africa and I met with the people at the Free Market Foundation and we started to talk both privately and publicly about a variety of issues, it seemed to me that notwithstanding the radical different circumstances of our historical beliefs, the kinds of principles that we would want to talk about in the abstract had a remarkable congruence one for another. And so what I want to talk about now is what I think as a matter of first principle some of these things ought to be, and why it is that this kind of commonality should and indeed does exist in these kinds of political deliberations. And from time to time I will make what occasional remarks with respect to the local situation, again subject to the caveat that I also make. Always take with care the remarks of an outsider who is not necessarily familiar with all of the details and intimacies of the current situation. Well, what is it, I think, that leads to the commonality of legal rules and legal aspirations? And here again, I think it's very good to go back to the classical legal writers who wrote about law generally and who tended to favor the rule of law and to favor simple rules. And the question is, what was their perception of human beings and the conditions under which they arose, which had sufficient generality to cut across various circumstances of time and history? And I think, in effect, that the arguments that I would rest upon or develop rest upon two kinds of related premises. The first of these premises is that by virtue of the nature of human evolution, although we may differ in many particulars one to another, there is a certain feature that links us all together. And that feature is that each of us has some degree of self-interest, some instinct, as Thomas Hobbes said, with respect to self-preservation, some preference that we develop with respect to ourselves and to our families and to our intimates, vis-a-vis the rest of the world whom we count as strangers. And that any legal system, in order to be accurate, must take into account both the potentials of and the dangers that are associated with this form of individual self-interest, understood in the way in which I refer to it as the self-interest not only of one person, but as a person for himself and for those who are most close to him or to her by way of family, kinship, affiliation, or whatever. Now the question is, why is it that this kind of a self-interest attitude is something that we have to reckon with when we deal with any effort to create a legal system? And that's because when you look at the external world, one might see a situation in which it turns out that there appears to be abundance, but that the fundamental condition of human life with which we all must labor is, in effect, the condition of scarcity of material and moral resources in the world, and that what we must do through a system of law is to try to find out some way in which we can make a fair and decent allocation of these human, moral, and material resources amongst the various claimants to it. The tragedy that one gets in trying to deal with a particular legal system, in all cases, comes when we try to pair up the problem of individual self-interest on the one hand with the natural scarcity of resources on the other. And the simplest way in which to put this point is as follows. There are, in fact, from self-interested individuals, demands for resources which always exceed the various supplies that you have. And so it turns out that no matter what system of allocation that you wish to adopt, there will be somebody who feels that he comes out short under the circumstances, given the fact that this condition of scarcity creates a fundamental imbalance between demands which are large and indeed in many cases justified, and resources which are necessarily limited. So what the task of a legal system then to do is to figure out under what circumstances or which kinds of principles we adopt to decide what kinds of resources allocation decisions can be made, to figure out which of these particular claims can be satisfied and which of these particular claims must be rejected. Now in doing this, what we have to do in a sense is to recognize that there's some kind of a background norm or condition of fairness that we have to have. I cannot get up there and say that the principal allocation that I defend is that folks who were born in Crown Heights in Brooklyn ought to be entitled to all the material resources in the world, knowing that this fine general principle would mean that Richard Epstein and all the buddies from his neighborhoods get whatever they want, and the rest of the world is left over with the scraps in question. No matter how partisan, no matter how special your own kind of interest, you will never be able to persuade other people to go along with whatever scheme that you propose if it turns out that you rig your premises in such a fashion that the conclusion comes out in your particular favor. Bias in human beings is, of course, a powerful concomitant of individual self-interest, and it's one of the things that we have to resolve and to watch when we talk about the articulation of rules. There is, in fact, no single solvent which prevents these preferences for oneself from dominating the world, but one of the great constraints that we believe in terms of dealing with this issue, is the following one. We wish to have some sense of generality, neutrality, and equality with respect to the rules, such that the individuals who propose the rules will not be able to propose a situation in which they always win, come what may in the world at large, but that these are rules which give them some benefits on the one hand, but also give them some proportionate share of the cost associated with the rules in question. If you can find a rule in which its champion is prepared to say that he will lose under some circumstances, you at least have some kind of a safeguard against the excesses of self-interest, favoritism, and bias, which are unfortunately part of the human condition. And so what I'm trying to do, in effect, is to figure out if we can get a set of rules which are formal in character, which allow us to come forward with general principles of allocation, which will dampen and limit the dangers of favoritism, which are inherent in the nature of human condition. Now, what might we want to do for this? Well, I think the first consideration, given what I've said, is that in thinking about the way in which legal rules are put together, we must, in effect, recognize that there are certain kinds of desires that we have about the world which we cannot satisfy as part of a just society. So that what we have to emphasize is not only the things that we're entitled to, but also the things that we have to renounce. Now, what would be this? Well, here what I want to do is to go back to a Latin expression, a Roman law expression, which was carried over into English law and has, to some extent, its parallel in virtually all other legal systems. And that's the idea, in the grotesque Latin phrase, of damnum absque injuria. And what this phrase means is that there are certain harms that occur without legal injury. And what this means is there are certain things that will happen in the world which will leave you worse off than you thought you would like to be, and yet, as a matter of principle, you can do nothing to protect. So ironically, the first way in which we try to figure out what the rules are of a just society is to figure out those things that we are not entitled to, even though we would want them very much. This is not normally your positive campaign for understanding the way in which the world organizes itself, but I think it starts to tell you something about what's going on. Well, now, what ought to be that particular thing? And here I'm going to propose the following test, at least as a first approximation, which I think will allow strangers to live together in relative peace with one another, notwithstanding the strong differences that they have. And then, hopefully, through time, will create a framework for interactions amongst people in which they can develop a greater sense of mutual community and self-understanding. So there are a number of paradoxes here. I'm starting with what it is that we have to give up, and then I'm going to argue, and I think quite correctly, that the only way you could have a sense of community is to develop a system of private property rights which allows you certain powers of exclusion. So let's see if we can figure out how it is that we put this particular thing together. Well, if you're trying to figure out what's going on, what everybody has to decide is what it is in life that he or she values most and what it is in life that he and she values relatively less. If we could find a way to give everybody those things that go to the core of their being and require them to sacrifice those things for which they have less of an interest, then in effect, by this mutual renunciation, all of us will be strengthened in our individual capacities. And so here, if we go back to the principle of self-love and ask ourselves the following question: would we rather have the power to lead our own lives, or would we rather have the power to dictate the way in which other people conduct their lives? I think most people would say they prefer the autonomy that they have on the one hand to the ability to control the lives of other people on the other hand. And one of the ways in which we can talk about the realization of that particular principle is to come up with a rule not of mutual affection, which it's very difficult for the law to inspire or to implement, but rather with a principle of mutual toleration, which means that we grudgingly respect people with whom we differ from by the following rule. You may, in the conduct of your own particular affairs, conduct yourself in a way which I regard as thoroughly offensive, and there is nothing whatsoever that I can do to alter the way in which you behave. And the quid pro quo for this is that, in fact, I may be able to conduct myself in a way which you would regard as thoroughly offensive, and if the only thing that you have going against me is the fact that you don't like what it is that I do, then it turns out that you cannot stop me. This is a perfectly general rule. It's one that does not try to say my sense of what is right or wrong is better than your sense of right or wrong. It is something which in effect benefits all individuals. It is something which burdens all individuals. And what it tries to do in effect is to say that each of us care more about how we live our own lives than about how other people live their lives. And so what we wish to do as a first approximation is to guarantee for us that which we care about most and to sacrifice that which we care about less. We're not requiring here that people love or admire or cheer on the behavioral styles of other individuals. We're just acquiring, in effect, a principle of live and let live. To which, in effect, if we say this particular thing, how much stress ought we give to the words mere offense? And I think we have, under these circumstances, to give enormous weight to these rules, to these words, lest we fall into a situation where individual autonomy and conceptions of individual liberty become intolerable senses of license. That is, if it turns out for me to live my life as I see fit and to exercise the conditions of my religion and deepest beliefs, that the only thing that I can do is to enslave you or to take your children and use them as sacrificial items for the purposes that I have in my own religion, at that particular point, it's not just mere offense. It's not just a situation where I disapprove of what you do on moral grounds. Now I'm saying it's not dislike that triggers my concern. Rather, it's the invasion and the trespass of my space by you, which happens to trigger it. So what we do, in effect, is we then tie in the principle that mere offense does not generate any entitlements against other individuals with an equally strong principle, which starts to say that to the extent that you cross into the private space of another individual, the keep-off signs that are imposed by the law are, in fact, absolutely essential for the preservation of the separate spaces and the realization of separate individual dreams that all people have. Now, some people might want to say, well, you guys believe in the market. After all, look down there on that particular sign and you'll discover that this is a free market foundation. So why is it that you don't have a world in which it turns out that if you want to get protection of your property and your body from other individuals, that you just don't go out and buy it in some kind of a market transaction? Now, that's supposed to be at least a little bit funny because it's such an odd suggestion. But in fact, if you understand why it is that this suggestion is silly, you will understand a great deal about why it is that we organize the world, or should organize the world, in the way in which I have spoken. Well, the question you immediately have to ask whenever you start to talk about market transactions is who are the individuals with whom you wish to engage in these particular transactions? And if we're now in the market in which we're trying to buy bodily security from other individuals, it turns out that there is no simple two-person transaction in the nature of a contract of sale or a contract of hire that will allow you to achieve the end of bodily security. The situation, quite simply, is this. If I happen to make a contract of peace with Mr. B, so that Mr. B agrees not to engage in aggression upon me, and I agree not to engage upon aggression upon him, the two of us cannot sleep at night, notwithstanding our contract, because there's nothing about this contract that will bind C or D or E or F. And it turns out that the larger the number of people that you have in a society, the more cumbersome, awkward, and difficult it is to try to enter into contracts with each and every one of them, such that when you turn out your lights and shut your doors in the evening, you can know that they are not going to be entitled to enter. If there's one person who decides to hold out from the mutual renunciation of force, then the entire system inside the country can in fact be destabilized. It is the one individual who stands at the tail of the distribution who will determine the content of the lives that everybody else inside the system lives. So when we start to talk about the appropriate social contract, before we worry about the aspirations of things that we would like to have by way of positive rights, we must all remember that the first thing that a society has to give to its individuals is the security of their own person and of their own possessions, such that they can organize their lives in an intelligible fashion. Voluntary contracts cannot achieve that particular result. Social contracts are required to do so, and those contracts require that we, in effect, say, not that individual consent matters, but rather the first condition of an orderly society is that all individuals agree to renounce the use of force against each other and against their property, and that they do so even with respect to those individuals whose practices they find deeply offensive. Now, within a homogeneous society, this may be relatively easy to achieve because it turns out that people are less likely to be offended about folks who are more or less like them. But it becomes every bit more important to stress this kind of principle when it turns out that you have a group which through history or circumstance has fundamental disagreements with its fellow citizens as to what is the definition of the good life. Under these circumstances, there's going to be a lot of offense out there, and you're requiring people to give up a fair bit. But by the same time, you're also guaranteeing them much more by virtue of the sense that the autonomy that this particular regime allows them to develop promises enormous amounts of good. Now, this autonomy principle that we start with is not going to be complete in itself. What it does for the most part is to emphasize the necessity of personal security, and what one has to do in order to make sure that the effective utilization of the world's resources can be brought to human benefit is to figure out a way in which individuals can acquire entitlements over external resources so that when they subject them to their control, they can convert them for instruments of good and for betterment. And so what we have to do is to have not only a regime of autonomy, but we also have, to some degree, a regime of property. The question of how it is that you organize a regime of property rights in the external world is one of the most difficult questions that any legal system has to face. And it turns out that there is an enormous conflict in many cases between the imperatives of history on the one hand, and in some cases the imperatives of logic on the other. Let me outline to you something of the conflict and leave it perhaps for another day as to how I would perfectly resolve it, or preferably resolve it, if only I had the power to do so. Generally speaking, when people engage in the world, you would ideally like to have a situation that before any individual took possession of any material resources, he could do so in accordance with the universal consent of mankind towards the activities in question. But it turns out that given the degree of temporal and geographical separation that exists throughout the world, if we were to wait until we had the consent of all of our fellows before we used any of the resources of nature for our own personal use, we should all, as John Locke reminded us when he wrote about personal property and the acquisition of property, we should starve. So that the strong objection against the system of universal consent for the allocation of goods when we're in or close to a state of nature is it is in fact akin to a mutual suicide pact. It means that nobody can take anything until everybody consents to the fact that somebody's allowed to take something, and by the time you walk out those particular negotiations, we're all dead. So we have to figure out another place from which we can start. And what we do is we engage in an act which is profoundly necessary for human society on the one hand, and in another sense regarded as profoundly asocial. And that is, we follow a rule of capture or occupation, which says that any individual may take anything which is unowned and unclaimed in the state of nature and treat it as though it were his own, notwithstanding the fact that there are other individuals who might wish to have those particular resources in question. And so what happens is we adopt a race principle, not the principle of race between different races, but rather a race in the sense of a running race. He who gets to the end of the line first manages to keep the thing and to exclude all others. Now, if in fact you have people who are widely dispersed and large numbers of natural resources out there, generally speaking, you're going to get relatively few conflicts out of this particular system, so that what happens is the first possession rule will yield a limited and partial occupation of the general riches of nature. People will then have their farms, they'll be able to cut down their trees and be able to grow crops and so forth without running into deep conflict with one another. But as it turns out, as societies become more crowded, as the races become tighter one to another, one can easily start to see a situation in which people say there is something deeply problematic about a world in which it turns out the fact that you managed to arrive at place X 1 minute before somebody else arrives there gives you the right to all of those resources in perpetuity as against that late comer. To put it in another fashion, as the races become tighter, the priorities that they create have fewer legitimacies amongst individuals. The great tragedy that one sees in trying to organize a system of property rights is in many cases they are acquired in circumstances where the first possession rule makes sense or doesn't make sense, and then only later on what you have to do is to figure out what are we going to do by virtue of the fact that the cost to those who are excluded is so great that we now have no place for them. And the major question that one has to face as societies become more complex is what evolution of property rights can take place to deal with individuals who do not arrive first on the scene. That is, to me, one of the problems that we have to deal with. Now, how can we deal with it? Well, one of the ways in which we have to deal with it is, in fact, a way which I think promises enormous benefits, has long been available to us, and has generally been underappreciated as a way to get rid of some of the imbalances that happen under a first possession rule without having to have a violent distension or transmutation of established property rights. And that's a situation which starts to talk about the use of voluntary contract from exclusive property rights. And this then in turn gets us to the second of the paradoxes that I was talking about, the situation where a sense of exclusion starts to give you a sense of community. Now, when somebody starts to talk about property rights, this is surely an image which gives rise to many conflicting visions on the parts of lots of people, as well it should. Property rights in many cases are thought to be instruments of exploitation and domination. That is, those people who have wealth turned out to exert political influence, and you have a situation when the rich get richer and the poor get poorer by virtue of the fact that the initial advantages that you obtain in this situation in nature are now magnified by the peculiar behavior of the political institutions that the rich and the powerful control. In a system of limited government, one of the reasons why we are so concerned with the regularity of law is to make sure that natural advantages that people might have gotten in the property derby do not translate themselves into political advantages that allow them to increase what is going on. The thing to remember about property is if the principles are neutrally and properly applied, is that you will give as much legal protection to the property of those people who are outcast within the legal system as you will give to those people who have great power. So that what you can say about a system of property when it is properly understood is that it affords those individuals who represented embattled minorities islands of security against the majority within any particular country. And when I talk about majority, I don't necessarily mean majority by way of numbers. Sometimes what I'm referring to is a minority by way of numbers which has a majority by way of power. And one of the things about apartheid, which from the outside point of view seems so utterly heinous, is in fact the way in which it systematically disregarded the property rights of those people who were excluded from the system. Forced dispossessions from land, moving into townships against one's consent, is not a kind of a result that can take place in any system which believes in strong property rights for its individuals. And if one is worried about the question of excessive political power and excessive discretion, the strongest way in which one can do that is to have a system in which a minority of one can hold out against the rest of the world within that particular territory which it has acquired. So one of the fundamental virtues of property is it protects the majority against the expropriation by the majority, where we understand here the ideas of majority and minority do not necessarily refer to simple numbers, but rather refer to the question about the aggregation of political society and its power, and this is something that we all have to worry about. The second feature I think that we must note when we talk about property under these circumstances is the way in which property relates to contract and contract relates to market, because these become some of the central conditions associated with the development of a society that can provide the material resources that are absolutely necessary for the maintenance of long-term political stability. When we say that an individual has a right to exclude and treat that as the hallmark of property, that, I think, is unduly negative in the way in which we describe and understand the right. A better appreciation of the right to exclude is as follows. The person who owns the property has the right to admit other individuals into that particular property and to therefore regulate the way in which the particular resource will be deployed. If you do not have a system of property rights, then it turns out that if you wish to admit one person onto your property to work with you, say, as a farmer, there's no way that you could keep anybody else out from the property who would choose to harvest the crop that the farmer whom you admitted has decided to plant. So that what happens is, without strong and secure property rights, it turns out that you cannot enter into voluntary transactions with other individuals which will promise them a fair return for the labor that they invest in the cooperative venture that they have with you. A system of property rights which gives one person or a group of joint owners sole and exclusive dominion over a given piece of property is an absolute precondition for the emergence of a market economy. By virtue of having the right to exclude, you get the right to admit. By having the right to admit, you can then deal with the third of our complex, or rules for a complex world, that of the primacy of voluntary exchange. And you can then hope to realize what all of us wish to achieve. By my giving up my right, and by your giving up your right, by the two of us entering into a voluntary exchange, which is protected from depredation by the rest of the world, each of us can obtain more of what we want in exchange for giving up something which we value less. And if we can enter into a single voluntary transaction where both sides are better off than they were before, we have now made a small improvement in the condition of society. What is so critical about the regime of property and contract, as we try to put them into perspective one to another, is that they are not one-shot rules. They are, in fact, rules that allow for their multiplication and their recursive use. What I mean by that somewhat complicated expression is as follows. After I enter into a voluntary exchange with A, so that A has something which he has acquired from me, and I have something that I acquired from A, there's nothing which imposes upon me a duty to consume what I have acquired. I can take the resource that I've acquired and swap it with somebody else in the next exchange. And if the second exchange is a win-win transaction, the way the first exchange was a win-win transaction, we have now been able to improve the effect of the, shall we say, the effect of a market system by creating resources of greater value from a fixed stock of natural resources. So the trick about a system of contract is the greater the rate of voluntary exchange that you can produce amongst holders of labor and property, the greater the number of positive-sum games that you could enter into, win-win transactions, which means the greater the wealth that you could create for the society in question. And if you have a world in which lots of people have holdings of property, which are relatively small vis-a-vis the whole, you do not have to worry about the downside of property, which is the monopoly control that one individual will have over some particular critical resource. So the idea of a system of first possession starts to look a little bit better, because one of the things that it does is it avoids the danger of centralized control over property resources, which then translates into monopoly behavior in markets, which is much less efficient than the outcomes that you get with respect to a competitive society. So that what happens here is it takes a little bit of patience and it takes a lot of understanding. But if in fact you work the system correctly, a system of voluntary exchange will be able to do something to counteract the fundamental problem of scarcity by allowing cooperative behaviors to take place amongst individuals. And if in fact you now have more resources relative to the set of wants that you have, the amounts of disappointments that you're going to suffer from people being excluded will in fact be reduced by abundance rather than by theft. So that the fundamental function of any society is to encourage positive sum transactions and to try to eliminate those things where the way in which a single person wins is to make sure that another person loses. This then gets us to the fourth of our simple rules. If we started with individual autonomy, moved to the creation of private property rights, moved to the creation of voluntary exchanges, how do we protect this system? And the answer is we develop a body of law, call it tort law if it's privately enforced, call it criminal law if it's publicly enforced, but the object of this particular system is to impose harsh sanctions upon those individuals who try to violate the rules of the game and to get something not through exchange but through theft. That becomes your primary objective. And sure enough, if you go back and you start to look at the way in which your particular tort laws have been organized, they in fact are fairly responsive to the concerns that are associated with the development of these simple rules. You have property rights in the person which are protected against aggression. You have property rights in things which are protected by trespass to land torts and trespass to chattels. And you have, importantly, all sorts of torts which prevent the use of force to disrupt voluntary exchange by other individuals. So that's the kind of thing that one wants to talk about. And now let me see if I can explain paradoxically how I think that this could actually help improve transactions that take place between people of fundamentally different backgrounds. And here I'm actually going to talk about something which relates to South Africa, but only by way of Chicago. Two eminent anthropologists at the University of Chicago are John and Jean Komaroff, both of who come from South Africa and have come back here time and time again. And one of the common discussions that we had, oddly enough, somehow or other in the discussion on medical ethics, don't ask me how we got there, was the following observation that they made. They said it seemed to them to be extremely odd that in trying to understand the interaction of whites coming from England and from Europe into black Africa, that the missionaries who had these odd religious beliefs seemed to do much better than the bureaucrats who came in without those particular kinds of religious sentiments. And they wanted to have an explanation as to why it is that the religious people did better in terms of their interactions than the bureaucrats. And I said, well, I think there is an explanation for it. It's not necessarily the one that you would like to hear. I said, one of the great things that you can say about religious people is they have no political power with respect to the individuals with whom they have to deal. The only way in which they can acquire what it is that they want, which is the spread of their religion or the values that they believe in, is to persuade other people that it is in their interest to cooperate with them. Whereas a bureaucrat who comes in and sets up a government doesn't have to show that degree of respect. They have coercive power, and you have to listen to them not because you respect them, but rather because they have the power to impose harm upon you if you disagree with them. What we can therefore say is as follows. There will be a sorting of the kinds of individuals who will go into these two trades. Those people who know that they want to go into the missionary business have got to be people who are sympathetic with those with whom they wish to deal, and they have to be able to understand their local customs and mores in order to be able to advance their own private agenda. So that the effort to trade in either material quantities or in spiritual quantities, because some kind of market mechanism works with both, is in fact something which encourages toleration by putting forward first those individuals who are most sympathetic with people on the other side of some kind of cultural divide. And if you could then establish the beachhead, it becomes incrementally possible for you to increase the level of interaction that takes place along both sides of that beachhead by voluntarily bringing into the position or into the situation those peoples whose sentiments are most sympathetic for trading and understanding one another. When, however, you start with the bureaucrat, the kinds of people who are attracted are those people who like to use power. often the kinds of people who like to use arbitrary power. Sometimes they're very well-intentioned people, but they are people who believe that they know what is better not only for themselves, but for what everybody else is. And since they're backed by an external sovereign, they tell the people whom they rule exactly what they ought to think and how they ought to behave. And if, in fact, you have that situation, not a market situation, but a command and control situation, what you will create is endless amounts of antipathies that will take place. So that what one has to understand, I think, is that in trying to deal with the problems of fundamentally different cultures, what you want to do is to find a way in which the initial set of interactions are by those people who are most determined on both sides to make these things success. Hope that when they succeed, they'll set an example for others and will be able to communicate back to their, quote, own kind of people what is going on in these transactions so that they can slowly improve the level of connection. And remember this, one of the advantages that you have with a diverse society is that people have remarkably different talents and abilities one to another. What a system of markets enables you to do is to harness those things in a way which work to the mutual satisfaction of all of the participants that are associated in the transaction. What it allows you to do is to create an environment in which there is win-win in the particular transaction, which in turn will have a political implication of reducing the tensions that otherwise exist. One has to understand in markets not only a situation in which people try to satisfy greed and self-interest, although they surely do that, but rather a situation in which the incentives for success, as created by the rules of the game, are such that it makes people better than they might otherwise be, because that's the only way in which they can work. And so in an odd sense, I could keep remembering what my mother told me when I was a little boy. She said, "Son, treat me like a stranger." Now, what did she mean by that? What she meant by that is when you go out into the world with somebody whom you don't know, and what you want to get something from them, what happens is you little rascally kid around the house, turn out to be charming. As hard as that might be to believe. What I want you to do when you come home and know that you're here is to treat me like a stranger, meaning in effect to show me the same kind of respect that you would show to somebody who has the power to leave you. And it's that power to leave which the other person has, which induces paradoxically good relationships in order to get them going. So in thinking about the future of South Africa or in thinking about the future of any place in the world, I think in effect that one wants to understand that if trade really does create mutual gains for both parties, you can in effect have a system in which single transaction by single transaction, you can go part of the way to heal the differences amongst you. And when one thinks back to apartheid, or when one thinks back to the racial regime of Jim Crow in the United States, the thing that saddens me as a libertarian more than anything else about those systems is the terrible things that they were prepared to do to people were always done in violation of the principles of autonomy, private property, and voluntary exchange that I've talked about. And yet all too often, the critics of those systems say they show you the dangers of a market system. And if there's one message that I would like to leave you with, it is this, that the absolute antithesis to a system of open markets is a system of structured government relations. That a system of markets wants a small and personal government that has neither friend nor foe amongst its citizens, but tries to enforce the arrangements that people create for one another through voluntary exchange. Whereas all the systems which impose racial orders, whether they be Nazi Germany, apartheid South Africa, or Jim Crow in the United States, depart from that fundamental principle by taking one group and allowing it to have a privileged status in the world at large. And the one thing that I would implore everybody here, in terms of your own future, is to understand that the principles of limited government, wherever they came from, turn out to be the strongest salvation with respect to any society that hopes to go forward in a world which will produce prosperity through voluntary exchange and hopefully human understanding through voluntary interactions.
We have extreme difficulty in applying the civil law. I mean, the sheriff, myself, my colleague, Mrs. de Kock of Sandton, and the other sheriffs in South Africa are charged with enforcing the civil law system. Basically, therefore, to enforce the orders of court. We do not have the support of central government. I, for example, do not have the right, if I knock on your door, to ask for your ID. If I lay a complaint with the police about some transgression of my rights as a sheriff or the plaintiff's rights as a sheriff, it is shrugged off on the basis of it's a civil matter, don't worry us. And I think one of the things we have the saying that justice delayed is justice denied. But if you aren't able to enforce a judgment of a court, you also deny justice. And the appeal I want to make to those who are in a position of authority is to support effectively the administration of civil law enforcement. And I just want to leave one thought with you. South Africa has approximately 500 sheriffs, and they have approximately 1,000 deputy sheriffs. In a larger office like myself, I'll have 10 deputies, and in a smaller office in the countryside, we may have a sheriff and one assistant. 1,500 people enforcing civil law as opposed to 150,000 police. Thank you, sir.
Look, the point here, I think, is a very powerful one. What is said, in effect, is the creation of a system of markets depends upon enforcement of a system of property rights and contracts. And if people know that they can breach with impunity, the self-interest that they have may lead them to take what has been promised to them and not to deliver what is returned. How does one deal with it? I think first you have to recognize that systems of taxation are necessary to increase the size of the infrastructure so as to match the size of the voluntary economy. And the second thing I think that one has to try to do is to simplify the basic structure of the civil laws so that the likelihood of breach by people who wish to comply with the law will be reduced. If you reduce the number of breaches, if you increase the legitimacy of the system, you will help the sheriff's office out, not by increasing staff, but rather by reducing the burdens upon that staff. And one of the things I think that you can do to help the enforcement of the civil law is to remove large portions of regulation, which in fact trap honest businessmen into making technical breaches of contract, which in turn then generate civil judgments, which in turn generate liability. What happens in a widely diverse society is that the number of common principles that people do believe in and which will generate the political support for you is stunningly few. One of them that I hope that we could all believe in is the importance of mutual exchange and or voluntary exchange with mutual gain. And so, paradoxically, what I'm saying is if you go back to the kinds of simple rules that I'm talking about, you can reduce the pressure upon your system and can therefore reduce the number of cases that you have to handle. You can increase the wealth of the system so you could attack the problem simultaneously at both ends. I think there's time for one more question. Ma'am, I think you had one.
In the context of South Africa, what do you think about affirmative action?
Now why is it when there's only 2 minutes left that somebody asks me a question which I can talk about? Let me see if I can practice standing, as the rabbi used to say, on one foot. I have a very strange or somewhat atypical view about affirmative action, and I will try to outline it to you very briefly now. I wrote a book, and I could see it's back there, and it somehow or other didn't get me drummed out of academic legal society, though people thought it might, calling in effect for the elimination of all the anti-discrimination laws in the United States, insofar, and here's an important caveat, they apply to private competitive employment markets. Now, one of the reasons why I happen to be in favor of that particular position is that it facilitates affirmative action, which is a kind of a paradox. That is, if you go back to the 1964 American law, it was stated in universal positions that no employer can refuse to hire any person because of such a person's individual race, creed, so forth. And the net effect of that was for many years to impose the very powerful restrictions on freedom of association, so that firms that wanted to engage in affirmative action were constantly threatened with lawsuits against them. My own view is that if a private firm wants to engage in this or indeed in any other employment practice, let them do so. And within the American framework, the result that you would have had is there would have been 1% of the firms that might have decided to exclude blacks or Jews or somebody else, but that 99% of the firms, understanding what the labor market and the product markets were like, would not wish to engage in those things, and you would have had affirmative action. Now, why do I prefer affirmative action by private individuals without an anti-discrimination law to the policy adopted in many countries, including my own, which makes it to some extent a national policy? That becomes the question. And I think the answer has to do with the question of how do we make trade-offs? And it's an extremely complicated set of decisions within any business to decide if you're going to have affirmative action, how much you're going to have, and why. To me, the key element here is the old Hayekian insight that nobody at the center can know the complexities that take place inside a particular firm, that what happens when you have bureaucracies is they have to go to standards and formal rules of one kind or another, which are extremely difficult to enforce because the one-size-fits-all regime that you impose means that certain businesses are asked to do something which they cannot, given the supply and the labor market, do, whereas other firms are asked to do much less than they might otherwise choose. The fact is that knowledge is acquired at the local level, and that the moment you have state-mandated policies, you lose that private information. Now, whom does it hurt? The answer is it hurts everybody, at least if you look at the thing in what I would like to call a dynamic sense. Let us suppose that you impose by state mandate a strong system of affirmative action, which is above and beyond the affirmative action that the firms would demand. And I have no doubt that there is a demand in the United States and South Africa for some degree of affirmative action. That has never been an issue in my country. If you look around, the same guys who you would call to be the most conservative captains of industry are desperately worried about the diversification of their labor force in order to survive. But if you put too much of a good thing, it becomes a bad thing. And now, in effect, if you constrict the size of the market, in the next generation there's going to be fewer opportunities and less wealth to go around for them all. So one of the things that you have to worry about in dealing with affirmative action is not a static model which talks about the number of jobs occupied by this or that group at time T1, the present. What you have to do is to ask yourself, what kind of an environment are you going to create for the next generation? And to put it in the simplest terms, if affirmative action gives a group, say, 50% of the jobs, and you have 100 jobs at period 2, you now, in effect, get 50 jobs. But if, in fact, what you could have done was to operate things at time 1, such that you have 200 jobs at time 2 because you have a more efficient market, then getting 1/3 of that market is better for you than getting 1/2 of a smaller market. So that what one must understand is that, in effect, the only thing in the long run which makes affirmative action work is the extent to which it contributes to the expansion of overall social opportunities. And governments can't figure out how that goes. What Hayek said on this point is correct. There is not enough knowledge at the center to make these systems work. And so therefore, for that reason alone, you ought to be deeply suspicious of any state mandate. The second point that you have to recognize, as they said a long time ago with James Madison, enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. And the problem that you get with great concentrations of political power is that one bad apple can have catastrophic effects on the entire system. In a market system, one bad apple runs one firm. If that bad apple is rotten to the core, the firm goes down and the rest of the market goes on. Government's got a monopoly. And to the extent that you have any monopolist, what you try to do is to limit the powers that that monopolist has, rather than conferring upon it more and more. You do not need to have mandated affirmative action in order to maintain peace and good order in society. You must be able to control the crime problem in order to achieve that particular end. My own view has generally been, always put public resources into those portions of your life which only government can do, and let private markets do the kinds of things that they can do better. So it's a kind of a division of labor and a specialization of labor. I do not know, and I am not a South African, exactly what the rate of affirmative action would be in the absence of government mandates. And I am sure to many people will be annoyingly slow. But the history that we have seen throughout the world is as follows. Those people who try to jumpstart success with violent acts of coercion succeed for one period and fail because their projects and their designs are not sustainable over the long haul. That the improvement of the material condition of a people depends upon the overall conditions of society being improved in a sustainable fashion. So that when you ask about affirmative action, just as you ask about any program of subsidies, the question that you have to ask is not only do we want it in the short run, but will we be able to sustain those kinds of subsidies in the long run? And here I think the general conclusion that you will find is that the short-term fix has a very high long-term price that's associated with it. The simple maxim is as follows. If one person is going to receive a subsidy, then somebody else has to pay the subsidy. If the output from one person is going to be expanded, the outcome from another individual is going to be contracted. You have to have enormous confidence that the people whom you're trying to support are in fact better able to do the things that you want than the people on whom you're opposing a tax. So that to remember the following proposition is critical. Government never takes from public funds. Government can only take from other people. So that what you have to do constantly as you're worried about this shift is not only to figure out what the subsidy will do by way of creation, but what the correlative tax will do by way of retardation of business. The standard neoclassical economic models say it's always a bad trade, at least if you're dealing with normal market goods. You can introduce situations where subsidies might be justified. So the working presumption of a responsible government should be, we will consider subsidies, but we will do so under a presumption of error. And I think that's also true with respect to affirmative action. When mandated, voluntary affirmative action is, to my mind, completely welcome, completely proper. The colorblind principle is a principle of governance. It is not a principle of market behavior. Yes, sir?
ANC Member of Parliament Michael Masuta commented on the labour market and property problems and asked Professor Epstein to recommend a solution for restructuring the economy to rectify the imbalances of the past.
One of the things that I strongly agree with what you said is, in fact, one of the difficulties of affirmative action is it only applies to those people in this country, the Africans, who are fortunate enough to be in the labor market to begin with. It doesn't help those people who aren't in it at all. It doesn't deal with the problem of unemployment. And that one has to figure out ways in which you can address something which is much more comprehensive. What would I recommend? Well, here it seems to me that one of the great sins of apartheid, looking at it from afar, was what it did to the educational opportunities of African children by systematically starving the school systems and depriving them of the human capital. I have no immediate short-term fix. I mean, I think anyone who promises one doesn't understand the gravity of the situation. Or as we sometimes say, if you think you really have a solution in that nice mathematical sense, it really means that you don't understand the problem. So what I'm going to try to suggest are some measures that I think will help, and then some measures that I think won't. I think one of the things that one has to do is to immediately seek to strengthen the educational system. And I would think that is not only with respect to the young, but also with respect to people who are normally past the age of schools. And I would be very strong in favor of subsidization of education because of the benefits that it provides at both of these levels. But I would do so not through centralized commands, but through vouchers of one sort or another. One of the ways that we, for example, in the United States, with tremendous success, were able to compensate for the real losses that individuals suffered when they, for example, fought in World War II, right? You know, they lost 6 years of their lives, they became wounded, God knows what happened, was we gave them the GI Bill. And the secret for success of the GI Bill was that the money went to the soldier who could pick where to spend it on education, rather than giving the money to some school and letting them figure out how to spend it. You give the money to consumers, they become much more careful, and they will demand of educational institutions what they provide. So here the battle between us is not whether or not something should be done by way of rectification. It's a question of doing it smart or doing it dumb. And the smart way under these circumstances is not to have group empowerment, but to have individual empowerment. And I think we do that. Now, can I just answer one half of the question and then I will stop? On the education and affirmative action question, I'm going to invoke a metaphor of Milton Friedman, not to persuade you that I'm right, but maybe to slow you down about the extent to which I'm wrong. What apartheid has done to South Africa is it has taken a perfectly serviceable boat and knocked a huge hole in its bottom, and what happens is water comes in. Now what you have to do is to figure out how you patch the hole. You do not patch a hole created by all sorts of weird distortions against markets by, in effect, creating another hole. And if you create a system of affirmative action which is inefficient, what will happen is, paradoxically, you will just compound the previous difficulties. You must remember at least one point. One encouraging feature of the system is that it is very difficult to transmit inheritance, privilege, by way of inheritance. It's amazing how quickly it can dissipate. The second thing to remember, and this is a real tragedy, it's not as though you could ever recoup the losses that apartheid inflicted. It's not as though these were gains captured in economic terms by the winning class. Lots of it was captured in terms of psychic benefits of a weird and distorted mind, and when the founders of that system died, those benefits died with them. So I think what you have to recognize is you're starting with a smaller base. And if you're starting with a smaller base, you have to be all the more careful in the way in which you use the resources you have. But I've overstayed my limits. Thanks for the questions. They're the right questions. It was my pleasure to talk to them.
After several other distinguished speakers had shared their thoughts, views, and solutions with us, Professor Epstein took the floor again to summarize the day's events and give his views on issues raised during the day.
I'm not going to say that I'll be brief, but I will try to state what I think to be some of the issues that really have come up in the conference after I gave my introductory remarks, and even some before, and try to respond to them. As you recall, the kind of talk that I gave essentially tried to organize and to discuss the private side of the situation, voluntary transactions, strong protections against violence, and things of that sort. It's very clear, both before and after in the conference, that as much attention is going to be asked of people who believe in free markets as to what they think to be the appropriate role of government with respect to the organization and provision of various kinds of state services. What I'd like to do now is to talk about that as a generic issue and then to comment in the course of that on some of the speeches that have been given, and hope that that will allow us to round out a situation in which we talk first about the private and then about the public sector. And the points that I would want to make is something like this. Anybody who is a libertarian and takes seriously the maxim that no obligation may be imposed upon individuals without their individual consent is a person who believes that no system of taxation is appropriate. That is a wonderful position, at least in the abstract, in terms of what you pay, but it's a rather horrible position in terms of the abstract, in terms of what you get. What happens, in effect, is without some degree of public enforcement, there is no way to ensure the protection that the substantive laws that we've agreed upon. There's no way to do that, and so therefore your society will fall apart. So what a libertarian society has to do is to figure out how it is it's going to finance a public sector that will enforce at the very least its fundamental commands. And here what happens is we switch the analysis from a discussion of the greatness of markets to a discussion of the creation of public goods. And a public good for these purposes can be roughly defined as one in which, in order to supply it to one individual, you have to supply it to all. And under these circumstances, if an individual knows that somebody else will pay for the good in question, he will take the position of a free rider, sit back. So in the end, if everybody takes the free ride, there's nobody stoking coal into the engine, and therefore the train comes to a grinding halt. And the system of taxation that one imposes is designed to overcome this particular problem, the prisoner's dilemma. I'm being drowned out already. The prisoner's dilemma that exists under these circumstances, where everybody says, for me, the no payment schedule is in fact the optimal path to follow. Now, how do you then try to impose these taxes? And the traditional libertarian answer is, what you try to do through the social contract theory is to replicate what you get through individual contracts. And that means, in effect, what you try to do is to tax each individual a certain amount in proportion to what they gain from society, and give them back in terms of legal protection and security of the interests that they have, something which is more valuable to them than what they've surrendered. So that what you try to do is to make taxation, just as the way you made voluntary exchange, a win-win kind of process. And of course, the obvious objection to this, which I'm going to get to in a moment, because in South African context it's an enormous objection, is that the system of taxation that I've talked about, the so-called benefit system of taxation, is in fact a system which permits for no redistribution. And we've heard, of course, today all sorts of massive pleas for redistribution, both as a matter of abstract justice and also as a question of how it is that we in South Africa, or you in South Africa, respond to the massive historical injustices that are associated with apartheid. But what I want to do, in effect, is to first explain on the blank slate why it is that there is something, I think, rather attractive about this position, and why it is that the libertarian benefit theory of taxation, if it is surrendered, should be surrendered grudgingly and not eagerly. And what this does is it gets us to the question of what is it that we are supposed to do when we suggest a regime of positive rights which goes beyond the enforcement of contracts, beyond the maintenance of good peace and order, and beyond the provision of public infrastructure like goods and highways. And here, I think the instructive way in which to look at this is to go back to see what Advocate Gumby said in her early remarks when she talked about the flour case. And the question was whether or not before the WTO we should have a rule which prohibits South Africa from subsidizing its flour producers who wish to compete in European markets, but who suffer certain impediments because of their own historical inexperience in dealing with these kinds of business. Now, the moment she mentioned something about anti-dumping proceedings, already I was in complete agreement with her. I think that there is nothing more destructive for any kind of society, and by the way, America specializes in the anti-dumping stuff, than saying, in effect, that there is some great national interest in keeping out a flood of low-cost goods that are subsidized by their home producers. As Mr. Katz said, or Professor Katz said, you can't figure out in many cases what is or is not a subsidy in terms of what these goods are doing, and so this is an inquiry that you don't want to have. So I'm in complete agreement that the WTO ought not to impose various kinds of anti-dumping duties. But now you come back to South Africa. I've heard a lot of stories about what seems to be wrong in this country. We've heard about desperate plights with respect to AIDS. We've heard about the appalling conditions of public health. We've heard all sorts of things about the failure of education. And any dollar that you wish to give to a flour subsidy is a dollar that you're going to have to take away from one of these areas. So even though it may be that the WTO has no business in telling South Africa that it cannot make gifts to people in Germany and into Belarus, I do not understand why it is that in South Africa you would choose to give this particular subsidy, impose higher taxes upon somebody else, and therefore leave yourself into a position where, in effect, the subsidy on one party creates a tax on others. Professor Katz, I think, was quite right, at least as far as he went, to say every time you try to impose a subsidy by way of tax expenditure, he says, you must raise the general rates. And the same point is going to be true, I dare say, if you don't use a tax expenditure to create the subsidy, but rather use a direct expenditure to create the subsidy as well. It doesn't matter which way you go. And what you have to do as a presumptive matter is to have a very high standard of justification with respect to the kinds of things that you're going to do through tax expenditure. Does that mean that we cannot find such justification? Well, I think you could find all sorts of wonderful justifications for expenditures, for tax and otherwise. And indeed, I agree with Professor Unterhalter, at least in part, when he says in many cases he prefers the expenditure route to the coercion route. And since I've never written any national commissions, I do not feel wedded to the one position or the other. To give you but one illustration, if the question is how it is we were to protect environmental issues such as endangered species, one mechanism is a massive system of coercion, which says that anyone who destroys habitat will be subject to powerful fines and restrictions. The net effect on that is every time you plow a plot of land or cut a tree, you may be running afoul of the law. It is surely, I think, under these circumstances, going to be a better system to have a tax subsidy or grant system which says, we think the preservation of certain endangered species is a public good, and we'd rather pay for people who preserve habitats. You're going to find situations where people will now create them voluntarily in order to get the subsidy, and in fact, only a small number of people have to participate in the program, and you do not get this massive overkill that comes through the regulatory arrangement. Well, that seems to me to suggest that sometimes subsidies are appropriate. And I also would suggest to you, in some cases, subsidies are appropriate through the tax system rather than being appropriate through direct payments. I referred earlier to the question of education. And you could add to that questions of medical care and all sorts of other assistances to the poor. There is a constant struggle inside South Africa. There is a constant struggle inside, even just personally. If we had charitable inclinations, do we wish them to go towards education or do we wish them to go to health care when they cannot go to both? If you put everybody in a room and have them argue about their favorite beneficiary, it is quite clear you will discover that the demands for subsidies, even by those who concede the legitimacy of subsidies, will exceed the available amounts for subsidization. What therefore ought one to do under these circumstances? A system of charitable deductions which in effect allows a matching grant to take place so that each person decides where his money is going to go, and then to the extent of the tax relief in question gets a public matching grant, is a way to allow people to make separate decisions on charitable assistance and to get public support for it. I much prefer that system of tax expenditures to a system of direct grants from the government to various kinds of charitable agencies who have not been able to demonstrate any degree of public support because they've never been able to persuade any private donors to give to them. So when one takes into account the political economy, I think it would be a mistake to say that tax subsidies are always inferior to direct payments by government. Here there is a powerful institutional reason why it is that you are willing to suffer the higher rates which Professor Katz talked about in order to achieve a decentralized system of allocation, which I think has enormous importance for what it is that we are talking about. Now, in terms of the situation here, I think the most powerful challenge to the position that I've talked about is the position that was taken by Judge Pius Longa in terms of his stirring affirmation of the socioeconomic or positive rights that are contained in the Constitution, which of course do not fall either within the class of charitable contributions on the one hand or the classic provisions of public goods that I've referred to a moment before. And the issue is whether or not we ought to welcome the inclusion of these positive rights in the Constitution. And I think we have to consider it again in two ways. First, we have to consider it as a matter of general principle in the assumption that there are massive inequalities of wealth which can exist in societies that do not have any history of racial injustice. And then you have to ask the question, as when you add in a history of apartheid, does it change the argument in question? And here, it seems to me that the case against these positive rights in a blank state of nature is in fact completely compelling, and that one ought to be deeply suspicious of it, because the question is, as Professor Unterhalter say, not what you promise, which can be the moon, but what you can deliver. And you'd much prefer a society that promises a little and deliver all that it promises to a society that promises you everything and can deliver to you nothing at all. What is the associate difficulty that is created with positive rights? Well, here I think the way to understand the problem is that any program of positive rights has necessarily within it two components. The first component is that of aspiration. The second component is that of execution. On matters of aspiration, I wish not to quarrel with anything that the judge said. It seems to me that we have a perfectly intelligible conception of why it is that the diminishing marginal utility of wealth is something which on balance suggests that some form of redistribution through some means is going to be appropriate. The question I'm worried about is the question of means. Can you achieve that particular end through a system of positive rights that is guaranteed and enforced by the state, or can you not? And the thing that I wish to say under these circumstances is that it cannot work, and that what is so difficult about the proposals is that virtually everybody who's in favor of them emphasizes the moral nature of the case and tends to be dreadfully silent on the grubby particulars of how it is these particular programs are going to be good into effect. Let me indicate to you some of the defects that are associated with this. When you wish to create a regime of positive rights, you have to know exactly what the content of those rights is going to be. It is vastly more difficult to define a positive right than a negative right. With a negative right, you say that people in effect cannot aggress against one another and that will enforce whatever contracts they make amongst themselves so that they can choose the appropriate resource level consistent with their own available means. With a system of positive rights, you run the terrible risk that you'll define the right sufficiently high that even after you impose the correlative taxes, you'll not be able to fund them, at which point what you will create is cynicism and disillusion on the one hand on the part of the citizenry who knows that politicians' words are always hollow because they do not have the wherewithal in order to achieve it. The second thing I think that one has to recognize is that dealing with a regime of positive rights, it is not correct in my view to say that they are interactive with and supportive of a system of negative rights. I think rather it's quite the opposite. To the extent that you have a system of positive rights, it tends to be in tension with and inconsistent with the regime of negative rights. As one indicated before, there is no way that government funds resources or programs out of its own resources. The only resources it has are those which it gains from regulation or taxation of its fellow citizens. The moment the government decides to impose those taxes on those other citizens, it necessarily reduces the amount of wealth which is available for the creation of private investment. The moment it reduces the amount of capital that is available in the private sector, it will necessarily reduce the opportunities for job creation in the private sector by changing the ratios of available funds. If that is the case, then in effect we can say as follows. Every creation of the positive right for an individual who turns out to be poor necessarily carries with it a diminution of the negative rights, to wit those of equality of opportunity, which you otherwise wish to have. And the reason it is precisely the one that Judge Lumber referred to. It is a case in which there will be fewer opportunities because there will be fewer private sector situations which generate the jobs in question. When you then figure out that the third difficulty of this system is there will be massive political struggles inside the government to decide which persons get what positive rights and which people get the contracts that fund those public rights, what happens is a dollar of taxation does not yield a dollar of benefits. A dollar of taxation yields God knows how many transfer payments to irrelevant parties and maybe 20 or 30 cents in benefits to the intended beneficiaries. You have a huge wealth loss associated with a desire for a higher utility transformation. Putting all of those things together, what you can say in the short run is that the program is not likely to succeed and that in the long run the implicit campaign of capital starvation means that the second generation will be worse off than it otherwise would have been the case. Let me give you an example which comes from life which I think shows the nature of the comparison. You want to talk about a devastated society, try Germany 1945, where you divided into the Western and the Eastern zone. And in the Western zone there was a little bit of subsidy from without, and certainly South Africa could generate some subsidy from within and indeed command some subsidy from without, which would duplicate what was received under the Marshall Plan. And then the key decisions that were made by Ludwig Erhard was the only safety net you had, ladies and gentlemen, was at the end of your own strong arms. There were going to be no system of price supports, there were going to be no labor protections or anything of the sort. On the other side, you had East Germany, which decided that it was going to give all sorts of positive rights. And anyone but anyone who looked at these two countries 15 years later would have to recognize, no matter what you think about East German or West German politics or what you believe about redistribution, West Berlin and East Berlin were basically different places. And we knew that because people were voting with their feet by the thousands to get out of East Germany into West Germany. And it was all the people who were young with opportunities and abilities that were leaving so that the welfare state would have only recipients but no longer have contributors. That's what happens when you worry about it. The differences in resource allocation that we are talking about are enormous, and the longer you go, the worse they get. Well, what happens when you try to combine this with the clear historical injustices of apartheid? And I don't want to come out here and sounding like I'm a defender of a regime which I regard as totally antithetical to every single principle of a sound human society. But I don't want to belabor that. The point that I want to belabor to you is the following simple proposition. There is nothing about the evils of apartheid which justify a regime of socialism or managed labor markets or managed capital markets going forward. There is no way that you will be able to undo any errors in the past by compounding the felony, by creating situations which make it impossible for honest people to earn honest livings. What one must strive for in this country is to get to the best place you can as quickly as you can. If it turns out that in a society that is devastated equally by an external agent, that a regime of positive rights works badly relative to the regime of negative rights, that balance is not going to change in apartheid. And what do we have here when you start to look at the situation? Well, in those portions of the market which are relatively unregulated, things seem to be working rather well in terms of the financial and capital markets, the decline of tariffs, and so forth. On the other hand, if you look at the markets which are most heavily regulated, to wit those which deal with labor and those which deal with education, which of course is not voucher provided, you find essentially chaos that is existing. I think even this natural experiment inside the country should indicate to you the strength and the soundness of a proposition which is stated so often and forgotten so frequently that it needs one more reiteration. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. If you wish to figure out where it is that you want to go, what you must do in each case is not simply take every program at face value on the assumptions that the aspirations it creates will in fact be respected when the program is implemented. What you must do in effect is be suspicious consumers who believe that with respect to government promises, caveat emptor is the only appropriate method in question of analysis and discussion. And when you do that, I hope that you will come to realize that the libertarian kinds of systems, or the market systems that one are talking about, are not systems which in effect say that we have a market without a system of transfers whatsoever. The charitable deductions, the voucher system for education are clearly indications that that is not the case. It is not the argument when you're talking with respect to the questions of a system of markets that you believe that there's no space for government enforcement. Quite the opposite. One of the tragedies of the creation of a regime of positive rights is it takes the best and the brightest and puts them into all sorts of highfalutin programs that will not work, and therefore the things that a state must do are starved for the resources that will enable it to do it. It is not just an accident that you have higher crime rates and higher rates of infection in a regime which prizes positive rights. What you have done, in effect, is taken enormous government resources and put them into a program that is bound and doomed to fail, and therefore have starved the programs that are necessarily state functions from their successful implementation. So don't treat it as though it's kind of a puzzle, that one thing has happened, and oh, isn't it just so terrible that the other thing has happened as well. There is a necessary connection here. No society can tax beyond a certain level without having the export of capital and the departure of labor. Once you know that there are finite amounts that you could gain through taxation and regulation, if you decide to spend some fraction of that on the creation of positive rights, you're going to have the opposite part of that problem. Less money to spend on criminal enforcement, less money to spend on contagion control, less money to spend on various forms of education. So what I would beg of you, at least from the outsider looking in, is understand that the principles of classical liberalism are not designed to kill societies in order to benefit the few rich, but are designed to create the kinds of open societies that will allow people to rise. I have to tell you, and I will confess, as you might have figured it out, I was more or less born into the lap of privilege. My father was a successful physician. But if you go back one definition, his parents were absolutely dirt poor when they came as immigrants to the United States, and the only thing that they had was opportunities. And what saved them as citizens was the fact that there was no regime of positive rights to help them along. My own fear was if there had been positive rights in New York City in the year 1900, my dad would have never made it to medical school, and I would have never had all the advantages that were given to me. So I think that you really ought to understand that to the extent that one asks for questions, the answer to this question ought to be very clear and emphatic. Is a situation in which economic opportunity is given to somebody who has no economic worth, are those rights of opportunity worth something? The answer that Judge Longer gave you was no, that unless you got lots of wealth, the opportunities don't matter. What I'm going to give you is exactly the opposite answer. If you're a guy who doesn't have a pot to pee, and quite literally, the things that you value most are exactly those economic liberties. And to the extent that a system of positive rights is incompatible with them, what happens is you are always going to hurt the ones that you love and wish to hope it more. The law of unintended consequences is not repealed in South Africa. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our agenda allows for some period of discussion, although the hotel have told us that they do want to have access to this room in 5 minutes. So there's not a great deal of time left.
One brief question. I support the notion that it's better to teach somebody to fish rather than giving the fish. But if you look in the context, say, of a society where all the ponds where the fish is already monopolized by major stakeholders who have a lot of influence as to who can throw they're let into the pond and who can't, through various ways. Where do you begin? It's about the question of how do you open up opportunities for everybody in the kind of economic system you're talking about. Thank you.
Right. I think the one word that I would dispute in the characterization of the comment that was made is the word monopolize. It's a very difficult word and it has two meanings. One, it's a world in lots of people who compete with one another, have lots of resources, and other people have none at all. At that particular point, there is no industry barrier that's involved. And so what would happen is a system of competitive markets allowing the infusion of capital to be there, and if you have a cheap labor pool, it will quickly be snapped up and will slowly be able to advance itself. If, in fact, there are formal barriers to entry, then, of course, you're absolutely right. One of the strongest arguments for welfare is if you deny people the right to work, then you must give them something by way of compensation. But it seems to me at that point you're faced with a fatal choice. I'll tell you what I think South Africa has created. I'll tell you what I think I would do. I think the situation here, for example, when we heard the speech by Mr. Francis about the legal system, is we have very high barriers to entry, so there's a kind of monopoly going on, and then what we have to do is subsidize the provision of legal care. My solution is get rid of all the barriers of entry. Any test you want to give, use it by way of certification rather than by way of licensure, and then give nobody any subsidy. A world which tries to counteract monopoly with subsidy creates the world of both. It's not a second-best solution. What you have to do when the monopolies are breakable, break them. And if it's a question of repealing barriers to entry, it's easy. So the answer is no monopoly, no subsidy, rather than both.
We seem to find costs in respect of negative rights completely acceptable. For example, the right to a fair trial costs a fortune, but somehow that's a cost that you seem to support, yet in respect of positive rights not. How can we account for the discrepancy?
Oh, sure. I mean, go back to what it was that I said a moment before. When you talk about a right to trial or a fair trial, what you do, in effect, is you have the state exerting its coercive power against an individual. Under those circumstances, you've got the individual dealing with the world's most powerful monopolist. Now the question is, can you disarm the monopolist? Answer to that question in this particular context is no, because then, in effect, you will have no law. Then if you cannot disarm the monopolist, then what you have to do is you have to subsidize the defendant. So what I said, in effect, is where you can eliminate the monopoly, you don't use the subsidy. What you have done is given me a case where the monopoly cannot be eliminated so that the subsidy must be provided.
And I think when our government realized that it wasn't easy to create jobs for everybody who didn't have one, they began to say, stand up and do it for yourselves. Now the first question that all of us who don't have jobs have been asking is, if you say we must create our own jobs, how can we do that? Because on the other hand, you say the education system that we've gone through has actually denied us the opportunity to be developed in terms of the skills to think in a way that is going to allow us to create jobs. Now, how does it happen that, for example, in a free market economy, one could realize a situation where people are not necessarily job seekers, for example, but they become job creators and can enter into a market and continue to survive?
All right, let me just answer a couple of the questions here. The last question you raise is, what do we do under circumstances to correct for the systematic educational deprivations of previous regimes? And I've indicated, and I would do this generally, is that a system of subsidy under those circumstances, which is appropriately done, I think, through vouchers, not through centralization, ought to be a way to get people some job skills. The second thing I think that one ought to do is to allow the formation of contracts in which the employer, as part of the practice, can pay low wages in exchange for giving an educational component. So that one of the mistakes of various forms of job protection and minimum wage laws is that it assumes that the only compensation that an employee receives from his labor is in fact the cash money, where in many cases it's the opportunity for advancement in education on the job, which is far more important. So I think liberalization in the labor markets will help with that. And the third point is the one that I've stated before. It is a mistake, I think, to evaluate these questions strictly and solely from the point of view of how it is that an individual reacts to the system given its current structure. What I'm arguing is you have to change the system, and that the implicit tax on the worker that you're talking about comes from the cost of funding the positive rights which shrink employment opportunities. Undo the positive rights, the compensation that comes back to the worker is a greater arrangement of jobs. And this then gets us to the last point, and it's something which one always finds a little bit corny, but I think has to be mentioned. If you're going back to the classical liberal tradition, it always contained in it some effort to try to deal with the problem that everybody here has been worried with, which is the disadvantaged nature of fortunes, when some people are tremendously rich and others are much poorer. And if you go back to the classical writers, they were genuinely ambivalent about the question. But at the very least, they thought strongly of the tradition of imperfect obligation. And that's a tradition which says that if you're a person of some substantial means, you are under an obligation, moral to be sure, to assist some other individual. Mind you, the law didn't much care, or the theory didn't much care, who it was that you assisted, and there was no legal sanction if you decided not to do it. But there were strong social sanctions, the kind that Mr. Unterhalter referred to in his talk, and in effect, a fair amount to do this. One of the ironies that I like to talk about is if you go back, as I do, to the American system, and figure out when it was that you had the greatest burst of charitable giving in the United States, it took place in the period of laissez-faire. And if you go back and you think of all those institutions which named like Stanford and Hopkins and so forth, they were all founded by robber barons who were named Stanford and Hopkins and Mellon and Carnegie and so forth. They understood this. This was part of their culture. I think what you have to do in order to create an effective civil society is to make it part of your culture again. And the way to kill it off is to require it by way of legislation. I think you have to understand that sometimes when you coerce behavior, you destroy the behavior that you seek to coerce. And the hardest thing in the world is when you know that something is right and you're asked to have the self-control not to force somebody else to do it. It's a terrible thing to have to ask people. It's a terrible thing to have to ask people when, in fact, so many people have been kicking them around so long that they just want to kick back. But if you don't follow the advice and you try to live yourself by the emotions, you're going to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. And that's not going to be to the good of anybody in South Africa.